myself in the risks and the challenges to the safety and health of all of our communities. Additionally, the civil unrest following the tragic murder and death of George Floyd, the calls for societal change centered around racial injustice, including the need for continued police reform here in Los Angeles as well as across law enforcement across the country. LAPD has responded to address these times, supporting our community and ensure the safety of shelters and testing sites. The challenges of the pandemic also to include reinforcing the mayor's Safer at Home directive and ensuring the safety and welfare of our people. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, our people also strove valiantly to strive to achieve and facilitate peaceful marches and demonstrations. Unfortunately, those peaceful marches and demonstrations we did see devolve, and where violence erupted, and that violence included attacks on officers, looting, and fires. Our people, in working with that and progressively applying different strategies and tactics, strove to restore order. We mobilized for the first time in more than 2 decades. A call out to the National Guard to protect vulnerable businesses, and a nighttime curfew was installed. Fortunately, I believe those actions saved lives and protected countless businesses. I also saw that the protests thankfully returned to peaceful demonstrations and marches, allowing our city to return to its more typical operations. And in the days that have followed, our city and region remains in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, including, as I said earlier, risks to our people as well as the general public, with nearly 200 of our personnel now testing positive with the virus. And across the course of this time frame, with Mayor Garcetti's 2021 budget, a budget representing significant belt-tightening and cutbacks for the city, including this department. For the department, his budget meant more than 100 fewer police officers working patrols, 140 fewer civilians, men and women that are working today in positions across the city that would no longer be backfilled or we would no longer be able to hire to attrition. And also devastatingly, the furloughs of a majority of our remaining civilian workforce, amounting to a 10% pay cut and nearly 200 fewer civilian employees. This budget represents more than 400 fewer personnel in this department, and these cuts are significant and will present difficult challenges in addressing and maintaining public safety. However, in the aftermath of the mayor's proposed budget was a council motion with additional cuts to the department totaling anywhere between 100 to 150 million. This past Friday, I reviewed the CAO-CLE combined report detailing potential cuts that would be needed to achieve that goal. I reviewed those strategies and do not support further cutbacks or the reduction of personnel. The level of cuts identified would take this department back more than a decade in staffing, which set up a very difficult operating challenge given the increase in workload that has occurred over that period of time. An example of this, for instance, is calls for service. From 2007 to today, we've seen a 63% increase in calls for service. When we look back at 2007 versus the record year, 10th year in a row of fewer than 300 homicides, if a look back at 2007 had 50% more homicides, just under 400 compared to last year. Had 100% more shooting victims, twice the number of shooting victims in 2007 versus this last year. So in conclusion, while I remain committed to leading a department that builds trust in all of our communities, working in effective partnerships in the shared responsibility of public safety, LAPD has led the profession in 21st century policing this past decade, and I'm committed to continuing in the months and years ahead with stronger accountability, greater transparency, and reimagined policing. Now, I've heard, as you've heard, calls to abolish the LAPD. But in those calls, I must bring to you as something I know each of you know well, and that is, as well as our society, that there exists a large body of evidence that conclusively shows that the more an increase in police resources that this city has invested in this department over the past decade plus has resulted in safer streets, improved public trust. And simultaneously, what is needed today is a maintenance of that staffing, a maintenance of those service levels. At the same time, we invest in social policies, investments in education, health, targeted therapeutic interventions. Those added strategies will also reduce crime. And this is not a binary decision of one versus the other. Reimagining public safety in Los Angeles means investment in alternative community-based services for mental health, homeless outreach and engagement, and neighborhood-based nonviolent interventions. Reaching these services is critical, as is maintaining our current resources, as proposed by Mayor Garcetti's original April budget. Our work going forward is too critical at this juncture to look at this as an either or. I believe it's a combination. I look forward to working with this council as we move forward in difficult and one of the most challenging economic times of our existence. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Chief. So, members, we can go to, before we take up item number 2, we can go to any questions that any members may have about police department's budget overall. Who would like to lead us off on that? Mr. Bonin, go right ahead. Mr. Bonin, followed by Mr. Koretz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I've got some questions now, and then I'll have some later under different specific topics. Generally, thank you, Chief and your team, for the presentation. I get your point, although in dealing with budget, dealing with finance, everything is an either-or situation. There's not an infinite amount of money, so every decision we make is either we do this or we do that. Every dollar in the LAPD budget is a dollar not somewhere else, and vice versa. So we are forced with either-or situations all the time, and they get harder and they get tighter when revenues are shorter. I also want to note, about where we make investments, what we get. I think it's also important to note where we don't make investments, where we get. Under the rubric of everything is an either-or situation, when we don't invest in other programs, homelessness goes up. When we don't invest in other programs, income inequality goes up and businesses fail. And when we don't invest in other programs, there's more deaths as a result of traffic fatalities. We can go through every single department and see what we get when we don't invest. So, as each of us weighs how to budget, we're weighing all of those considerations together, and many of those are also issues of public safety, of preserving life, and of preserving public health, and of providing emergency response or preventing the need for emergency response. I'd like to ask a couple questions about specifics. I've been asking in this committee for the past couple weeks for a couple different things. The first thing is a breakdown of call volume, both 911 and non-emergency calls to the department. As part of the CAO's and CLA's report today, they have given us some breakdown of that. Although a good about third of it, I guess, is just classified as officer-initiated calls. I'd like to know if it's possible for us to get a more detailed breakdown of calls.
Yeah. So let me clarify that on page 2 of 2 on the Los Angeles Police Department Communication Division dispatch calls for service on that report that was in the CAO's report on Friday. I'll draw your attention to that. So for clarity, last year the department had 973,958 calls for service. In addition to that activity, officers initiated themselves an additional 975,000 approximately activities. So when you look at call volume is not the code 6 officer initiated. It's everything above that line. It includes everything from screaming persons to rape, kidnap, indecent exposure, forgeries, all types of calls. And that breakdown is on page 1 of 2. It's actually on the preceding page of that two-page document, and it shows the various call volumes that you have there. For instance, in disturbances, which is a 415, that's a code, but that's 166,863 instances last year. If we look at, and as we look to mental illness, just under 21,000 of those calls for the year. As we look at indecent exposure, just under 12,000. So those are the assault with a deadly weapon, 54,000. So each of that report gives you the detail and the breakdown and the spread of where these activities are, how they result in calls for service. I must mention that in addition, these are the actual dispatch calls, that we actually only dispatch about 1 out of every 3 calls to a communications center, and we're able to direct those calls to 211 and 311 services. These are the actual police response for a need for police officers, or what I really hope to see us move forward in this next generation of public safety, identifying an alternate service delivery plan that would allow another city department or community-based organization to take on. And I draw your attention to mental illness. Just under 21,000 calls last year for mental illness. And so what I look forward to is the day in which mental health professionals are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As you know, this department has doubled its mental health SMART teams with clinicians working alongside our personnel. But it needs to be ramped up many more times. And in fact, what I think it really needs, what I'm positioning for as law enforcement chief of this department, is that mental health be in our neighborhoods, conducting outreach and engagement with those suffering from mental illness with them by themselves and not in the accompaniment of police officers. Now, there's instances in which that won't apply because of the violent nature that the individuals may face. But for far too long, mental health services in this city is a Monday through Friday 9 to 5 proposition, with the exception of the 70 SMART teams that we have, generously supported by DMH. But we need that to be tenfold that.
Couldn't agree with you more. Of course, the question is going to be who should be doing it, city or county, and who should be paying for it, and where the funds come from, which is kind of where we are right now.
I agree, and that's my whole point of this budget of this year is while those tangled and complicated and convoluted conversations need to occur, we need to maintain our ability to handle those 21,000 calls because there isn't a resource in place today to pick that up. We can imagine it, we can wish it, but to do it is going to take a lot of work and a lot of wrestling with agencies that to this point have not had their full expression of support in these areas.
Yeah, and the messy and tangled conversation is in committee this week, is in council next week, and I'd say has been out in the streets for the past several weeks. I've got some questions about one of the big ticket items here is disturbances. That's a pretty big category. Is there a way to get any further breakdown of that, or is it all just simply classified as disturbances?
Well, you have a minor disturbance, which is a 507. That's typically going to be a loud radio. It's going to be an annoyance of a neighbor, perhaps doing auto repair in their yard. These are matters that, again, this is an area that I look forward to developing alternatives that we could have community-based organizations or others that would be ambassadors that could go and try to resolve those. That each of these disturbances, we have to look at it carefully to see if there's threats of violence. But to give you, just so I recognize the public listening in does not have these numbers perhaps nearby, a minor disturbance last year, 66,000 instances. And on a more serious disturbance, which is called just a straight disturbance, 167,000 calls. So out of 950,000 calls, you have over 200,000 of them that are simple disturbances. And I think this is an area that's rich for analysis and determination of why is 911 at 3 in the morning, why it exists is most calls exist at all times of day and night. But the only resource that's available to go to them is wearing a Los Angeles Police Department uniform. And that's got to change.
It does have to change. I mean, you can go through this list and we could talk all afternoon about things that could probably be reprogrammed. indecent exposure, illegal dumping, intoxication, minor disturbances. You could argue reckless driving and traffic collisions, welfare checks, disputes, open door windows, animal calls, mental illness. I mean, you could. One of the reasons we asked for this is we want to be able to quantify just sort of how much of the department's call load that is.
Yeah, and I think one of the areas of challenge for this group as well is to stretch the paradigm of what a call that can be handled without the requirement that an officer be there. And I'll give you an example today. We are staffing sites for COVID-19 with the absolute demand that they be there because of a lack of confidence in other resources providing for safety and security. And so for this agency, for far too long, it's been seen as, well, we'll have LAPD handle this. And so we welcome the opportunity to offload and redesign the service call delivery system so that non-law enforcement entities outside of this department can handle some portion. Now, how much that is, we're going to have to find over time. But right now, at the end of the day, 911 has become the default system for every public disorder, and the default response is either police or fire.
You're right, and that's exactly what we need to be fixing. I mean, it's not going to happen entirely between now and July 1, but I mean, now is the time for the city and elected officials to get real about changing this and moving things to the appropriate jurisdictions. I mean, I don't think anybody in their right mind, if they were going to sit down and start from scratch, designing a response system, would say that the appropriate or necessary response to illegal dumping, or the appropriate or necessary response to a neighbor playing the radio too loud, would be armed agents with the authorization to use deadly force. I mean, just nobody in their right mind would come up with that.
This council just did. This council just with illegal dumping in downtown Flower Mart and during the COVID-19 called for that very matter. So I would argue with you, sir, that we are asked repeatedly on a number of these areas to be the first in, and we're trying to change that paradigm. But let's change it with resources that have been established, defined, and in place, then transfer it. Now I'm transferring it to a line that no one answers.
Well, yeah, we need to be transferring it and creating the thing simultaneously. In yesterday's New York Times, they had, I don't know if you had a chance to see it. I know you're busy. We all are. There was a story. It didn't look at L.A., but it looked at a number of other cities, including Sacramento and New Orleans. It managed to quantify the time officers spend on different things, not just sort of the calls. And it figured that in most of these cities, violent crime was about 4% of an officer's time. Property crime was about 35%. Are there metrics that the department has that could give us that kind of analysis about how time is spent as well as calls?
Absolutely. The department utilizes a program, a workload analysis called Patrol Plan. It was adopted by this council more than 30 years ago. Presently, we spend about half of our time doing administrative tasks. It's one of the reasons why I've asked for and gained this council's support for the establishment of the Deputy Chief of Information Technology Bureau so we can modernize our systems that are terribly out of date. We are presently facing legacy systems that are going offline as we're trying to transfer over to NIBR, which is a new nationwide look at crime. And in our current systems, half of our time is done on paperwork. The other half of the time, about 45% of it is call load, and about 5% of it is officer-initiated activities.
Does it indicate? Is call load just one category, or does it indicate different types of calls?
No, it breaks down the workload to see the types of calls. This is analysis that the Office of Operations conducts regularly as we balance the workload. As you said, you can have 100 calls, but they don't represent the same body of work. There could be one homicide in there and 99 alarm calls, or there can be 5 homicides and 20 burglaries. It's the mix of those numbers that make up the workload. And so we look, that work, it's a queuing system. I believe it's one of the more refined systems in allocating workload and identifying resources to work the demands across the city.
Great. If you could make a copy of that available to the committee, that would be helpful as we do further deliberations. Question on the overtime budget, something else I've been asking for, and it's not part of the CAO-CLA report, is a breakdown of the drivers of overtime, both reimbursable and non-reimbursable, in terms of sort of events, whether it's, summer deployment at the beach, or whether it's the Academy Awards or a Lakers parade. We'd like to see how that's broken down.
Well, unfortunately, we haven't had a Lakers parade in some time. And so, as far as reimbursable versus non-reimbursable, let me address first the reimbursable. The reimbursable overtime is, for instance, the MTA overtime. It is also a significant portion of when we look at the Academy Awards or events at Staples, special events in which the organizer pays the city for the cost of the resources. So in looking at our fiscal year 2020, the vast majority of our work, just a moment, was about 880,000 hours of reimbursable. And what's in there is the establishment and the expansion of the MTA contract, where each day we, around the clock, deploy officers on bus and rail, and the cost of those resources are then reimbursed back to the department. There's a minor amount of other reimbursable amounts to about $21 million that comes from these other special events. Now, the vast majority of our non-reimbursable overtime is split amongst functions of extended watch for emergencies, workload that has officers completing those administrative reports, those crime reports, as well as off-hour responses for homicides and violent crime investigations. And then a smaller component has been what we've typically have most recently described as carve-outs. And these are focuses by this council for us to dedicate resources to a bridge home, the supportive police services around those areas. This current budget fiscal year, we're asking for $8.4 million for that. The cannabis enforcement partnership, this is going after unlicensed establishments. That was a $5 million ask. Last year, that number was $10 million, so it was reduced by half as an effort to curtail the cost and the impact of this. And then Vision Zero, as well as the Human Trafficking Task Force, which amounted to $3 million, none of which, all of which was not actually funded, but were instead council direction that we take it from our existing, if you will, reservoir or amount of money that we have. So that's the general breakdown there. I will remind the council, Councilman Bonin, you and others that 2 years ago, the CAO's office was invited to come into the department and do a top-to-bottom review of our overtime. And then this last year, I was thankful for their findings, which was that overall the vast majority of overtime is not scripted, is not pre-programmed. That is a result of workload and emergency situations and circumstances, and that then it needed to be appropriately funded. Secondly, is that I'm committed this last year to reducing it, and what we saw was a reduction. We were able to curtail extended watch overtime and our court overtime. Now, the court overtime was helped by the fact that COVID has shut down court operations, but leading us into March of this year, we saw a reduction of about 100,000 hours of overtime because of stricter management and control over the use of overtime.
So, thanks. I mean, for me, there's two different conversations about overtime. One is the reimbursable, which I'm curious about, and the other is the non-reimbursable, which I'm very interested in because that's sort of a different category. And I appreciate your updating me on the latest. I'd love to, if you could send the latest data so we can actually dig into it and look it over. I'm just curious, though, just sort of spitballing. even with the cuts that you just described of the 100,000 hours, over the past, say, 10 years, as the size of sworn personnel has grown, has the non-reimbursable overtime gone up or down or stayed constant?
Two things have happened. It's gone up, and two primary factors. One, COLA, the cost of living increases that have been bargained and issued. And secondly, and significantly, has been this issue of carve-outs, of specific dedicated overtime details, such as the Human Trafficking Task Force, the Cannabis Enforcement, and Vision Zero. Those have been significant cost centers that far exceed efficiencies that we were able to squeeze out by looking at our individual day in, day out operations.
I get the point. You're being kind and subtle. What you're basically saying is you guys asked for it, meaning the elected officials. Elected officials pressured you to do more, and the way you did it was overtime because we didn't give you any other funds for it. You're totally on point to say that. So I've spelled it out a little bit more clearly for you because that's an accurate dynamic, and we should speak candidly here.
Councilman, please, I'm saying this in support of this council's wishes in the sense of what this council and the safety of Los Angeles. I don't mean it with an air of an edge to it or resentment. These are.
I wasn't suggesting that. Don't worry about it.
But I think it goes to this whole conversation of this year as we move into 2021 is that we must remind ourselves that this is not a zero-based budget. This is a budget that's been built over the past 2 decades, and it's reflective of core values and strategies that, frankly, has achieved one of the safest times in our history. But there's pressure on that. There's significant pressure with homelessness and the violence that we see in our communities. That this is not that have been proposed and motions that have been drafted, in my view, can have a significant and severe impact on our ability to achieve the safety that we've seen.
So, thank you. I'm trying to remember what my question was now. Oh, so for the non-reimbursable overtime, I understand a big driver in that has been the cost of living increases. People get more per hour or per shift. Do we know, or can we find out, what the number of overtime hours has been? As we have added officers, I'm curious. One would think if you add officers, you would have less of a need for overtime hours, except when we add additional assignments. So what I'm curious about is whether or not we can find out whether or not the number of overtime hours we have used for non-reimbursable have gone up, down, or stayed constant as the size of the sworn force has gone up.
Yeah, so the size, just for clarity, the size of the workforce has remained relatively stable and actually has decreased over the last 5 years. With the addition of the MTA, for instance, that is what moved us from 10,000 to 10,100. Now we're back to 10,000, so we're 100 fewer officers. That frankly means we're at 9,900. In addition to that, the workforce has been downsized as we've dedicated resources to HOPE teams and into our outreach engagement dealing with this crisis of our generation, this humanitarian crisis. So when we look at the overtime hours, the number of hours working patrol, extended watch, homicide investigations, those type of things have remained stable or gone down. It's the carve-outs for the unique features of Vision Zero, Human Trafficking Task Force, and the Bridge Home staffing that has increased the number of hours. But to your underlying question, yes, we don't spend money. As was taught to me a long time ago. All we can do, what we manage, is hours worked. Is that people work a measure of work to do a certain return on that investment. The cost of that, the underlying cost of that measure of work, is the financial cost. But what we spend is hours. I don't give cops, I can't give an officer $20 worth of overtime. I give them an hour's worth of overtime, or I give them a half hour. And when officers work specialized investigations, for instance, we talked about how many hours are you spending on this investigation and what is the return on that investigation. It spoke to the enormity, as you saw, with the mobilization of our organization, something that hadn't been done in 2+ decades, is because that is a very, very, very expensive proposition. And one of the reasons why we tried to downsize that mobilization as quickly as possible was just the daily expense. Lastly, on that issue, when the COVID-19 started back in March, I had a number of people within the organization, and I might say also looking at other city departments that mobilized. They canceled days off. They canceled vacations. They had people come in on a full all-hands matter. We didn't do that, and we saved the city millions of dollars by mobilizing only a small segment of our workforce, and those were from non-patrol settings. So we're committed to managing the resources and recognizing the finite number of them. And I'll have the numbers of hours to you today.
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you. I got some other questions about liability and some other stuff that have taken up a lot of time, so I'll go to my colleagues, and then maybe I'll come back. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bonin. The other members have questions for the Chief? Mr. Koretz?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it appropriate at this time for me to ask questions about the cuts proposed in the budget memo?
Well, we're going to come back to that in a minute. I'm going to ask Mr. Price to go ahead and introduce that motion in a minute. So this is more for background information and about the general budget.
Okay, I will hold off on that then.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of things I wanted to ask about if other members are compiling their thoughts. First, Chief, I want to ask you about the impacts of cuts and furloughs of civilian employees of the department. Now, back in the Great Recession, the department underwent cuts, and most of those cuts fell on civilian employees, and as a result, we had I'll ask you to speak to this, but we had an awful lot of civilian activities, civilian jobs that were being performed by sworn officers. And so we've worked for at least the 8 years that I've been chair to try to re-civilianize those positions and make sure that we have civilians doing civilian work, and we've had some degree of success in that. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about what the furloughs of civilian employees of the department in the mayor's budget mean, and what further cuts in civilian employees of the department would mean in terms of your deployment of your employees.
So thank you, and you're right. The deployment of civilian personnel prior to the Great Recession LAPD's numbers were in excess of 3,500 civilians, and the civilization of workload in LAPD has been something that we have strove to achieve, and actually members of this council have argued and petitioned for the department to further civilianize and encourage desk operations and other functions be done by civilians in place of sworn members, because that would allow those sworn members to go redirect it back out in the field. And this city, through the terrible pain of the recession, saw a free fall in the number of retirements and ERIP separations, and we fell below 2,700 civilian members at the low of our staffing. And then over the last 6 to 7 years, 8 years, this council began steadily reinvesting in this department to reinstate those positions. You may recall at the low that property rooms throughout Los Angeles, those rooms were shuttered. That we had one facility that actually had 24-hour-a-day property room, which required officers to travel long distances and hugely inefficient means for also people to get property out of storage for within the department. We saw detention officers that had to be backfilled and replaced by more than 100 sworn police officers because of the inability to have detention officers working our jails. So we saw the recovery, and we saw the recovery incrementally. And this last year, we moved to about just over 3,000 sworn members. 3,000 civilian members, with the hopes that we were going to continue to expand, because we still have jail operations that have remained at mothball. we still have a number of civilian positions that we have officers working that we believe in excess of 400 additional sworn members could be found if we were to find a way of identifying civilian staffing. So that's why this year's budget cut, in the sense of the mayor's belt tightening and needed cut, because the size of the city cannot continue with the economic depression that we're facing. That's why it was so severe, because it was severe not only that we lost 140 positions as proposed, but additionally that the remaining civilian staff, with the exception of PSRs and detention officers, were going to be subject to a 10% reduction in their furlough. And that means 2 days every month, one every pay period, that they would not be at work. That comes out to an equivalent of 190 full-time people. So 190 full-time people that we no longer have in the work site, another 140 that we don't rehire or we don't backfill once they retire, is going to have a very significant impact on our ability to provide services. As a reminder, I believe a number of you were on the council when we lost a significant ability to do fingerprint analysis, when we saw a reduction in our forensic lab services, when we saw backlogs in our records and identifications where people could not get copies of reports for months at a time. And those numbers, those service levels, have not come back to 100% yet. And so this furlough is going to have impacts that ripple across the organization. And this most recent motion, I know it's not before you yet, but this most recent motion that we would stop hiring entirely and not just jeopardize those 140 positions, but the other 200 or so positions that we expect to attrit, would have a devastating impact on our radio communications. Today, we answer about 85% of our 911 calls within 15 seconds. And the reality is that those numbers would further deteriorate, and we would see what I won't say brownouts, but we would see operations where our ability to answer calls within 15 seconds would drop well below 80, closer to 70%. But the state standard, the mandate, is that 95% of all 911 calls be answered under 15 seconds. And again, we currently are doing that at about 85. And in the process of doing that, we staff overtime because we have 60 vacancies with PSRs. So we have to staff overtime so that we can just maintain those call levels. And so this idea that we would, a proposal that we would further shrink the civilian workforce in these critical areas would have here's what I would worry about. It's what I worry about already, because when you call 911, an operator should answer within seconds to get help and emergency coming to you. And I'm old enough now to grow up where the parody was televisions of you've reached the Los Angeles Police Department and you'd be placed on hold. And you'd be placed on hold for a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And these service cuts that we're talking about here have those type of real-life implications. So these cuts that in the mayor's budget, I believe, with the 140 that are prioritized for public safety, or the remaining ones that are prioritized for communications and jail operations, are critical to our work at managing what we're at. And this idea that it would expand beyond that is troubling. And I'm hopeful by this council's actions and the CAO that the effort to incentivize the remaining size of the city's workforce to take and leave the organization, leave the city for savings that could then be redirected back into furloughs. I'm hopeful that strategy finds merit with this council and we find a way to do this. Our people many of them are tasked with jobs that are larger than just their assignment, and with this crisis that we have, I'm significantly concerned about the morale and about their ability or their willingness to remain with us.
Well, thank you. And I think just following up a little bit on Mr. Bonin's point about diverting some of the call load elsewhere in non-emergency, non-criminal situations to appropriate agencies. I'm really pleased that we're moving forward with groundbreaking efforts to do exactly that, and I hope we'll do that expeditiously. But in the meantime, when someone calls 911, they need a response, and they need an immediate response. And I think that every single one of our offices, of all 15 council members, has probably heard many, many, many times the frustration of constituents who express to us their shock that when they call 911, they don't get a response as quickly as they believe they need to have it. And so I'm really concerned about the impact of loss of these civilian positions and what it would have to aggravate that situation. Let me ask you also about jailers, because the city has, just let's first draw the distinction. The county of Los Angeles, not the city of Los Angeles, runs the vast majority of jail capacity in the county. The central jail and everything else are county operations that the city has nothing whatsoever to do with. But we do have jails as well, and much smaller jails. And we've been working for years to try to ensure that our jailers in all of the city's jails are civilians rather than sworn personnel. So how are we doing on that? And what will happen to that trend under the current budget that you have before you?
So it would worsen. We currently have 40 police officers that are working in a custody setting in lieu of vacancies that we have with custody services. And so and of course with the addition of Harbor Jail this past January, after a decade of being mothballed, this council's leadership and support allowed us to open up that position, with which took 27 DOs in order to occupy 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Now that is helping policing in the sense of efficiencies, as officers are no longer required from the Harbor San Pedro area to travel all the way to 77th for routine bookings, and so we're saving hours of time. But that opening also further complicated our ability to operate the 3 primary jails in addition to the Pacific and Hollywood jails, which remain open. I see, in the absence of us hiring, I see shuttering those jails. I cannot see operating those in our current way. And so whether that would be the Harbor Jail, which would be the most efficient, because it would shut down, they hold about 70 people at the most. They never have that census. Their numbers are very low because there's frankly not that many violent crime arrests, and we have a no-bail setting today. But nonetheless, it's a processing and holding facility that what allows us. We're booking, my staff just gave me, we book 5 to 9 people a day there at the Harbor Jail. But if you go to Harbor, if you go to Pacific or you go to Hollywood, you would see much higher numbers. So those 2 jails operate basically, they require about 10 personnel to operate each of those separate facilities versus 27 in Harbor. These are the complications, and again, I'm hopeful that we can maintain DO hiring, detention officers, so that we can deal with the attrition. We're not going to be able to expand jail operations. We have a jail in Southwest, we have a jail in Foothill, we have a jail in Devonshire. Those 3 facilities would allow us to further simplify an officer's travel and officer's time on processing arrestees. But we recognize also that the terrible fiscal crisis the city is in, and that it can't afford to expand at this time. But we'd ask that we not contract. And if there was any proposal that we would not hire DOs, which has been a part of a motion you not yet heard, that further is complicated if there's also a similar motion that we cut back on sworn hiring. So these are perfect storms of just compounding problems with a workforce that, again, the mayor's budget already cut. The mayor's budget reduces by more than 100 sworn positions and 140 civilians. Lastly, vacancy rates. We can cut this a couple of different ways, but really the pragmatic point is we are not going to have enough personnel to do the work that we have. We're going to have standing vacancies. Vacancy rates go from 18 to 20, 25%. Those are just not rates that we can look and say that we can take a 25% cutback in staffing and do the same job. Now, we got to reimagine, we got to redo things, but there's a limit to what that means as far as the processing and care and custody of people in our charge.
Okay, and you mentioned the Harbor Jail. What's the annual cost of operations for the Harbor Jail?
About $2.6 million, $2.7 million.
Okay, great. Now, a little bit more on overtime, and I hope that in coming months, this committee will dive much more in depth into police overtime and ways that we can reduce that cost and more appropriately utilize it. But in the meantime, I did want to talk specifically about court appearances, because this has been one of my pet peeves for a long time, that we're spending the overtime money that we need to have officers appear in court at times when they're not otherwise working. So can you talk to me a little bit about steps that the department has taken to try to reduce that particular category of overtime, and what would be helpful in further reducing that cost, whether it's a deployment schedule change or otherwise? What would be helpful in that regard?
The court overtime as an instance of frequency has gone down. It's gone down with the arrest rates, felony and misdemeanor arrest rates, the decrease in narcotic related offenses as far as those arrest rates. So overall, the trend is in the right direction. The most recent reforms with no bail and with court operations has also obviously severely reduced or eliminated it. I am concerned on that last arena that I think those are well intended, and we need to pay close attention to the recidivists, those that are been arrested and then re-arrested and arrested yet again. But the courts are challenging themselves as to the paradigm of what does it mean to attend court, what's the requirements to do so, and I think that in the months and year, this next year, that I look forward to seeing what else can be done. I would caution that I do believe that every time we go through a contract bargaining, that this is an area that we have a tendency to increase compensation rather than decrease. And so we moved this time, for instance, from a be there court appearance, inflated from, I think it was a 2.5-hour engagement to a 4-hour minimum. And so that guaranteed an officer, if he or she goes to court, whether they're there for an hour or 4 hours, their minimum compensation is 4 hours of court time. Now, what we try to do to minimize that is minimize the subpoenas and minimize the instances in which officers are called to court. And that's our work with the DA's office and the CA's office, which is ongoing. This is a maintenance function that we've got to continually go at it so that we control, because we don't subpoena officers. We have the the district attorney's office, and those deputies are second year deputies, and so they have a tendency, through their own, they can write a blank check about how many people they need to go to court for their case. And so we're constantly regularly working with the leadership within Jackie Lacey's office and her criminal branch to limit the instances in which they issue subpoenas. There are mechanisms to minimize court appearances called Prop 115, where an officer can testify on behalf of others at the prelim stage. And so we encourage that to be practiced by having what's called a rule of 3, where we have more than 3 people subpoenaed to a court. Why is that? And then trial courts are notorious for placing officers on call, or all must be there on the first day of a trial setting, which the first day of a trial setting, there is absolutely zero chance that case is going to go anywhere. But yet you could have 5, 10, 15 people subpoenaed to court. So those are the efforts of us, striving to minimize it. And again, I want to go back. We saw prior to COVID-19, we saw a reduction in our court hours attended. So I think the processes are working.
Very good. Thank you. Members, anything else before we get into item number 2? Mr. Blumenfield, and we'll come back to Mr. Bonin.
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize, everyone. I had internet problems, and when Mr. Bonin started asking questions, coincidence or not, that's when my internet went down. And so I've only caught bits and pieces of the conversation as I was trying to patch together internet through my phone and other means. But I did want to make a few comments and have a couple of questions, and I apologize if you've already covered some of this, just say that and I can get the answers afterwards. But at the outset, we're in a budget crisis, and I just want to make it clear we need to get out of that budget crisis, and no department can be exempt from that. At the same time, I don't think that we should be doing anything punitive, or we should be in the position of trying to defund the LAPD before we have other things in place that can cover some of these other calls. Although, as I've been very public about, I do think that there are other ways to deal with a lot of the 911 calls in and a lot of the other services, and I'm excited that right now we're on the cusp of reimagining all of that in a productive way, and I've heard, even though my internet was going out, that Chief, you were interested in that and accepting that and see that as fully in line with the department. So that's really positive. We need to have other tools in the toolbox besides the LAPD for dealing with all these issues, particularly mental illness and a lot of areas. And I know, Mr. Bonin, right before I got cut off, you were going through a whole number of them. So I just wanted to jump in, just a few opening statements like that, to sort of where our North Star needs to be. But then the question is, as we get down to brass tacks and what these cuts mean, and I do think they are, it is a significant amount that's being asked in terms of the dollar amount and what that means for the department. The civilian positions I'm particularly worried about. Does that mean if for every civilian position that is lost, that we're going to have a sworn officer filling those in lieu of the civilians? And is that really saving us money or costing us money? And can you hear?
Can you hear me? Okay,
yeah.
So, Councilman, thank you. So the 140 reduction, which is non-PSR and non-detention officers, are going to impact us in forensics. It's going to impact us in audit division. It's going to impact us in police inspectors and people that are doing work and the oversight and accountability of the department. And so the criticality of that is I can't afford to put 140 one for one. I'm going to have to. Instead, I want to identify what I'm going to stop doing. We cannot, slip back into a process of a one for one. We just don't have, with call load up being 63% increase in call load since 2007 to today. I don't have, even if as we maintain zero attrition, we're down 100 fewer police officers today than we did a year ago, and we need to recognize that further moving another 100. I have to stop some deployments someplace else. So I'm weighing those very carefully, and would just encourage that. But to your point, though, we have to be a smaller department. It's my petition here for you today is the clear-eyed look at what this department needs to look like in April is still a relevant one for today. And despite the critics and those that petition for the people's budget and otherwise, I hear their voices. I hope and look forward to the time of reimagining ourselves where there's functions that LAPD is not going to do, sworn or civilian. But until that process is here, I would encourage us to stay invested in our civilian work staff. They're professional. They're still understaffed for what we ask them to do, go out and get accomplished. They earn my respect, and I'm proud of them. And whether it's 140 fewer positions and the furloughs, it's going to have a dramatic impact on their ability to get the work done.
Right, and there's a nexus between those folks and some of the serious crimes that are being investigated, correct?
Yeah, so one of the nexus is our ability to understand where crime is occurring, and also our ability to solve the crime because of forensic services and the science the technical services that they're engaged in. In addition, it's the mechanics. It's the people who keep the wheels on the bus, as they say. This is a budget that we know going in has a motoring fleet that is under a great deal of stress because of just under $1 million worth of damage coming back from this, resulting from the protests and demonstrations and the attacks on our black and white fleet. So these are holes or gaps that in each of our technical and specialized services by civilians that would deepen.
Right, and another area, I don't know if you covered it, but the technology. You and I have talked a lot about the technology. Past couple of years, we've included funding for the records management system, upgrading the obsolete computers, because those investments are supposed to pay for themselves by reducing the amount of time and personnel needed to do written reports, transferring data, all that stuff, getting the computers to talk to each other. And it kind of boggles my mind because no matter where you come down on some of the critical questions that people want more police on patrol, this investment makes sense because it allows officers to enter information on tablets in the field and put more officers on the street. For people who don't want to see officers on the street and want to see the reduction in the LAPD, this investment also makes sense because if every officer is more productive, it's easier to argue that we need fewer and that this to right-size the organization. So for advocates of reform, having better data about the work in something much closer to real time should be a goal. So I'm really confused by the cuts to eliminate or reduce the records management system. I wanted to get your take on what that means.
So again, in the mayor's budget, it provided for us to continue our transition to the updated record management system. It's already years behind schedule because of earlier deferred investments. It is a $2.2 million need, and if it is not provided, it jeopardizes our ability to successfully transition to the National Incident-Based Reporting Standard, which is a federal requirement for January of 2021. Secondly, the life cycle replacement is about 1,000 desktop computers that are still under Windows 7. People may ask what Windows 7 is. It's a system that existed before that's no longer supported. These systems are taking minutes in order to simply turn on and frequently crash under the need for officers as they're writing a report or attempting to import body-worn video or other more present-day requirements. So those two functions are about $3 million. And I've heard the critics relative to the size of this organization. And the size of what we invest in our technology is so disproportionately small in regards to the return we get on that technology investment, meaning that the $1 million on life cycle replacements will allow us to ensure that the safety and the cybersecurity on those machines is there, that we're not taken down by a Trojan horse or by a spoof that comes through the network, and because of an out-of-date software and hardware, we end up taking down the entire network. The same with record management. We've got to get off of paper-based systems and get into to digital tablets. We have funding from the Police Foundation on a number of other matters to augment this, but in fairness to the philanthropic community, they're asking for where is the public dollars in this shared responsibility of this modernization effort. Again, this council and this mayor began supporting that a year ago, and we're making strides already, but we're not done. This is not a race that's a one and done. These systems are systems that have been deferred and delayed and ignored for many, many years.
Yeah, and I would argue no matter where you come down on sort of the reimagining of LAPD, this is critical. Getting the technology to be in real time creates accountability and it creates efficiency, and it's very positive. I wanted to ask you also about banking overtime. To me, generally speaking, banking overtime doesn't make fiscal sense. It just pushes the cost of today's LAPD onto future taxpayers. It's not particularly fair to officers either, because they deserve to be paid for the time they've worked. But pushing these costs into the future I get, and I see the report, that it might be necessary to get us through this fiscal crisis, but it actually is just forcing reductions in the future, taking away money that could be used for other needs. And so I'm concerned about it, and I'm concerned about it being sort of like an expensive credit card. When we bank overtime, and that's a result of us cutting overtime, we're basically paying a very high interest because people are going to get paid back at a much higher rate. But one way to avoid the escalating costs of this banked overtime and what I would call the generational inequity that such overtime contributes to would be to move expeditiously to pay off the banked overtime through FEMA and other eligible non-city funds that can be used to reimburse the actual overtime expenditures. Since we have a lot of officers in the field accruing FEMA-related, and I know I'm a broken record on this FEMA stuff, but it's the only place where we can actually bring more money into the city that's not capped. But I would say if we could move forward on taking our banked overtime and trying to pay that credit card down by using the actual FEMA-related overtime in the field, we would be doing ourselves a service as a city and basically paying off a high credit card. So I hope we can move to that, to doing that, and I would move that we do that.
So, and I'll second that. If that's a motion, I'll second it.
So if I might just respond for a moment, this budget committee has a tremendous amount of pressure and responsibilities as you see a city budget that has suffered so harshly in regards to revenue. And there have been efforts with the CARES Act and with eventual reimbursement from FEMA to address public safety related emergencies. I think both of these CARES and the FEMA reimbursement are both geared toward helping cities deal with unexpected revenue loss, but you'll still go about essential duties and essential services. And so that prioritization does support, but I also recognize that this committee is competing with a lot of competing demands. And so the efforts of deferring overtime by compensation, time compensation, is extensive. This year's MOU provides for a two-step COLA, which is going to return an increased cost of those hours a year from now versus today. And while officers may use a small portion of those time banked hours, the reality is that the $110 million that are currently sitting in our overtime bank would go up by as much as $80 million. Now, we have done this as a city in the past during some of the very dark days of our recession. And there may be a cash flow issue moving forward. I listened to earlier the conversation about the borrowing and so forth. But there may be a cash flow issue, as there just was by this city council, where last Thursday, or before, I had to switch to compensatory time for the men and women that were working during the mobilization because of the inability to meet payroll. And that was widely received with a great deal of angst and frustration on the part of the rank and file. But it was needed for me to do so that I could make sure that I could make the July 1st payroll. And so those hard decisions exist. And whether or not the cuts that are beyond what are in Mayor Garcetti's initial budget proposal in March need to occur, deferring overtime for me, while it's certainly I want to avoid it, I can't avoid it at all costs. If I have to, if monies must be found because of cash flow or otherwise, that is the least of the worst solutions. Meaning the verse cutbacks in sworn personnel or further cutbacks in civilians.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I guess with the FEMA, at least we know there's, that theoretically we get that back in 6 months or however long it takes us to get that money back. And so it's sort of putting the debt on a credit card during that time. But at least there's an end date to making what is a bad financial decision. So that's my hope on some of that banked overtime, is that we can avoid that really just poor financing decision. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blumenfield. And I think on that point about FEMA reimbursement, unless there's further discussion or comment about it, I think we can just take that as an instruction to the CLA to bring that back as well as part of this discussion. So thank you for that. Mr. Bonin, you had your hand earlier. Did you want to?
Yeah, I had a couple follow-ups and a couple additional ones. On the question I asked, one of the first questions I asked, I just want to make sure I was clear. There's a category of calls on that CAO attachment you and I were going over, Chief. We have the subtotal of everything broken down by category, and then below that there's a subtotal of Code 6, officer-initiated activity and traffic stops. I'm wondering if it's possible to get a breakdown of what the officer-initiated activity was for. I assume some of those are responding to a crime that they witnessed. I assume some of them is, well, I'm not sure what they are. I'm wondering if we can get a breakdown of those.
Well, let me look back to our computer-aided dispatch system that was installed in October that may offer greater granularity in the type of quote-unquote Code 6 or officer-initiated activity.
Thank you.
We can look at dispositions and so forth to try to figure out, tease that out a little bit more.
Okay. Another question. I thought I heard you say, and I actually lost contact with the meeting for a few minutes, not while Bob was speaking, though. And I thought I heard you say that call load to the department is up. Is that correct?
Yes. Looking at we look back to see where we were at a staffing level that was proposed or as one of the motions, which was 9,700, which was in 2007. If we look at the call load, there was a report that was provided to you as part of the CAO's report that lists the call load from 2007 and then lists the call load from 2019. It's on, just a moment, I'll give you the actual place it's on. It's on page 10. And so if we look at that number, it broke down call types by emergency call types, urgent call types, and non-emergency contacts. And what's there is it shows the percentage of increase for each of those categories. I, in my fast math skills, totaled up the three categories, and then compared the call load between 2007 and 2019. That's the 63% increase.
And how is it from year to year from last year?
From the year before, call load actually, just a moment, I just had that number. It's either flat or it's like a 1% decrease.
Yeah, on the breakdown on the attachment of the calls, it looks like it's down.
Yeah, it went from 998,000 in 2018 to 973,000. So that's approximately 20,000 calls. So 20,000 calls out of a million was that 2%? Yeah,
2.5. Yeah. Okay. And then because the conversations we're having now, as difficult as and uncomfortable as they are, this is my feeling is, and I've been saying this for a while, is this is just a preview of what's to come. If we have to cut another $45 million to $400 million out of this budget, there's no way we're not coming back and having further conversations about the LAPD budget. It's just there's no way with a gap that big we can do anything but look at every department. Had another question. At first, it may sound slightly off topic, but it's about how we spend our money. there was the story in the paper the other day about the Llewellyn, the Minnesota company that does training. And in the story, the department said that it was incorrectly or falsely advertised that the department was going to be doing that, which I'm glad to hear given what I've seen reported about that course. Also curious, I've heard that LAPD has in the past, I don't know how recently, had officers take training from somebody who specializes in what he described the art of killology. Grossman is his last name. And I'm wondering, how much are we spending on training, and can we get a breakdown of what kind it is so we can look to see if we have more of this stuff or if it's something that's part of the LAPD of the past?
Absolutely. We have all of our training is detailed, cataloged, and I can just I have no idea where the killology reference is, but that just doesn't pass the mustard test or the smell test at all. From there's no way that I could see us justifying that. But we'll look into first of all our training calendar and where our resources are spent on that outside and internally. We'll be happy to provide you.
Okay, great. He refers to it as killology. It's actually called the Bulletproof course. And
again, another thing that I'd have no temperament. This is not. These are slang terms that, to my view, just demonstrate that that's not a course I want our people at.
Yeah, and that's why I want to get a look to make sure we can bleep that kind of stuff out. Okay, thank you.
All right, members, what I'd like to suggest now is that we go to item number 2 and hear the report from the CLA and the CAO on item number 2, and then continue our discussion both with the CAO, the CLA, and the Chief. Let's go ahead and call that matter, please.
Item number 2 is a CAO and Chief Legislative Analyst report relative to identifying at least $100 to $150 million of cuts from the Los Angeles Police Department's budget and recommendations on an engagement process to seek input from disadvantaged communities and communities of color that would provide recommendations to the Council on the use of the city's general fund and improvements for our public safety service delivery.
Good afternoon. This is Sharon M, the CLA's office.
And Mr. Chair, it's Rich Llewellyn from the CAO's office. We also have Tyler Munhall, our police analyst, should there be detailed questions for you.
Good afternoon.
Rich, do you want me to start?
Sure. Thank you, Sharon.
Sure. So, members of the committee, the item before you is a joint CAO-CLA report in response to motion Martinez, Price, Rodriguez, Wesson, and Krekorian relative to the identification of $100 to $150 million in reductions to LAPD for the purposes of reinvesting these funds into disadvantaged communities and communities of color. Our report does identify the $100 million level as well as the $150 million level. You've heard from the Chief of Police, and you can see how difficult it was to arrive at that $100 to $150 million level. The police department is 94% salaries, so the only way to really achieve those positions are mostly in the areas of hiring and overtime. There's really no other way to achieve it. Layoffs are not part of the city's policy, and so we try to avoid layoffs as much as possible. Maybe I could turn it over to Rich to go through the cuts, and we'll have some more comments after that.
Sure. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do want to point out that, as the Chief made clear, all these cuts are real. There was no fat in whether there's fat in any of our budgets. The police budget this year was up, but it was almost exclusively up because of MOU increases. It was not increased services. We have recommended, or you consider cuts, very significant cuts to personnel, as the chief pointed out, reducing the number of sworn employees to the current level, cut sworn hiring, cut police sworn overtime, cut civilian hiring, cut civilian overtime. It's the only way, as Ms. So pointed out, you can get to that level of number. In addition, in services and supplies, we have on before you potentially cutting vehicles, cutting some technology, which Mr. Blumenfield mentioned, in a sort of a generalized cut to contract services and expenses. These range from, it cuts, as you put out on page 6, we put them in bands A through L. All of these, except for the very first band, which is the Crenshaw line. The MTA is starting that line later, so they will be paying us later, and that is the only one that does not hurt service delivery. Every other one, A is the Crenshaw line. B is reducing the number of personnel to the number currently filled, which means eliminating sworn positions.
Mr. Llewellyn?
Yes, sir.
I want to interrupt you just for 1 second to ask everybody to please mute unless you are Mr. Llewellyn. And when you're ready to speak, you can unmute. We're getting a lot of feedback.
Thank you, sir. C is eliminate the small amount of new activities in the department, about $2 million. D is a proposal to reduce civilian overtime. The total budget is just under $10 million. A $2 million cut would be 20%. E, reducing sworn overtime. The total budget of non-reimbursed overtime is about $109 million. This would be a significant cut to that. Reducing our car replacement. Again, it's important that we renew black and whites regularly, but in a tough year, we put some of those things off. G and H are both technology that Mr. Blumenfield has talked about. I are sort of general reductions to expense and administration. The budget is about $45 to $46 million, a $5 million cut. Again, the police department has certainly, the chief will maintain that's cutting bone, not extra. J is a proposal to cut sworn hiring in half, not to eliminate it, but to cut it in half. K, close civilian hiring. Also, we understand difficulty. And L would be even further cuts to police sworn overtime. We realize all of these are tough, and the chief certainly has made his case that there isn't a lot to cut in the budget this year, but we have done the best we can to produce a list that we think is the most palatable for your council's consideration.
And if I might add, we do believe that reductions are necessary for all departments, especially during these fiscally challenging times. However, this motion also proposes on reinvesting these dollars. And we would just certainly urge caution as we think about incurring additional expenditures until we have more certainty on the city revenues. As you know, you've already heard earlier from the CAO during the year-end financial status report that we're already ending the year $100 million below anticipated, as well as you would previously heard from the Office of Finance about our potential revenue shortfall of next year in the neighborhood of $45 million to $409 million. So we are at a budget imbalance at this point. And these two factors could actually have a very significant impact on our reserves and forebode actually additional reductions in the upcoming year. So we know difficult decisions are ahead. And so we do have extreme concern about expending additional dollars. We need to think about stop digging a larger financial hole for ourselves. And so there is real concern as we think about spending dollars. We do believe the size of the LAPD budget, it is necessary for them to be part of the conversation as we talk about budget reductions to maintain fiscal balance. Rich, do you want to talk about the reinvestment process on what we see? Rich?
One last point on that. Thank you. Sorry about that. We do propose that to the extent that you determine to take some of these cuts, that you move the money into the UB at this point. We believe there needs to be a sort of, one, there's the fiscal reality that Sharon has pointed out, which I could not agree enough with the Chief Legislative Analyst. That is something we are arm in arm on. The second point is we believe that you should talk particularly to your departments, but the broader community, about how to reinvest should that be the direction you go. You have many departments, as we list, including EWDD, HCID, particularly in their community investment side, the new Civil Rights and Human Relations Department, that will be trying to do outreach in these areas. We think they should be sort of helping you inform how to move that money back out, including the broader community. You will want to hear from the broader community and from your kind of internal experts. So our proposal at this point is, to the extent that you take some or all of these cuts, you move them into the UB, and then sort of take a slightly longer kind of deliberate process on how to spend those back out.
And finally, our report just also contains some historical information on the LAPD budget. There's just been a lot of discussion about the size of LAPD, the percentage of the LAPD as part of the city budget. And so we have in our report some percentages. You can actually see that the LAPD direct appropriations since the year 2000 has actually declined some. Their unrestricted revenue is the amount that's actually increased. And I think also submitted to the clerk for attachment C and D, there's been a slight revision. It was just technical changes. And with that, I think we are available to answer questions.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'd like to turn first to Mr. Price, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't. First of all, thank you also, CLA CAO for the presentation. I don't know if the chief is still on, but just wanted to say that I really appreciated his perspective as a committed law enforcement executive and professional, multi-years in the field and here in Los Angeles. So, Chief, we appreciate you, and I want you to know that we know you're doing all you can. But I do appreciate your perspective. My perspective is that of a 69-year-old black male citizen here in the city, a member of this committee, representing a constituency with a majority black and brown population, sometimes called communities of color. And I was one of the authors on this motion. And so I understand deeply the frustration that many are feeling and have felt, and about the need to reprioritize our spending, especially as it relates to public safety. So having said that, I want you to know that I really have appreciated the testimony today and before today, leading up to today, and the very thoughtful recommendations from the CAO and CLA. Based on all of that, I'm prepared to support the reduction of $150 million from the police budget. Not to defund, but to recommit, especially to our underserved areas. I think we need to demonstrate that we are serious. And $150 million, I think, certainly offers a chance to reinvest resources in ways that we have not before. We know that these cuts are going to be difficult. As was pointed out, these cuts have been made not just of the police department, but for all of our city agencies. We all are feeling this pinch. But given the transformational times and the fact that we have a chance to reprogram some funds, as I said, I'm supportive of this transfer of $150 million. I look forward to a community process to allocate and to monitor this spending in the ways that have been outlined by in the report. but now I support the transfer of $150 million and to reinvest this amount in disadvantaged communities and communities of color in our city. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Price. I'm going to share a couple thoughts, members, and then we'll go into any comments that anybody would like to make or questions about specific issues in the report. But I think it's important that we, before we do that, we take one step back because this discussion about the police budget has obviously been a lightning rod right now, and it's been central to the historical moment that we find ourselves in. So I think it's important to take one step back and put this moment into a larger context. So first of all, COVID-19 has obviously led to an economic and a budgetary catastrophe unlike any that we've ever experienced in the history of the city of Los Angeles. This massive decline that we've had in economic activity resulted in a similarly massive collapse in the revenues that the city's budget depends on. Now, in the 8 years that I've been budget chair, this committee and you members of this committee and our predecessors literally saved this city from bankruptcy. And then we carefully built up the largest reserves in the city's history during that time. That 8 years of work was absolutely essential to the city's survival in this COVID crisis because we've had to spend vast amounts just to keep people alive and to meet emergency needs at the very same time that revenues have collapsed. Those reserves that we worked for 8 years to build up were decimated in 3 months. So the mayor's budget already significantly reduced spending across most departments, including furloughing almost all city civilian employees. Those cuts and furloughs that the mayor proposed are going to cause a terrible impact on critical core services that our communities depend upon throughout this city. And in the 2 months since the mayor released that budget, as Ms. So mentioned, our financial situation has gotten even worse. Revenues will now come in at least $50 million and maybe as much as $400 million lower than what the mayor's budget is already based on. So since our reserve funds have already been essentially depleted, the shortfalls that we know will be coming can only be addressed with more cuts. The mayor and the city council have a mandate and a responsibility to ensure that this budget is balanced, and we don't have the ability to raise taxes or run up deficit spending like the federal government can do. That means we need to be responsible enough to do the things that are necessary, even if those things are unpleasant or unpopular. And the simple truth is that the financial situation of the city right now is such that it cannot reasonably be addressed without also finding savings in the police department budget. The proposed reductions that are before us in this motion are very significant. But the cuts we're facing in our other core services, including services that are vital to our most vulnerable residents, disadvantaged communities and communities of color, would otherwise be much too extreme for the people to bear. In my view, none of these reductions, if they're approved, would reflect negatively on the importance of LAPD or the professionalism of its civilian and sworn personnel, any more than making necessary reductions in the budget of other city departments is a reflection of their value. For me, making thoughtful and significant reductions in the LAPD budget is about responsibly managing an unprecedented fiscal crisis and still meeting the critical and urgent needs of this city and its people, especially right now when so many people are hurting so badly. So I want to speak a little bit about what Mr. Price mentioned about this moment in time as well. Because in the 4 weeks since George Floyd's brutal and racist murder by Minneapolis police outraged and disgusted the world, the people of Los Angeles have united around a historic nationwide demand for fundamental changes in law enforcement, for violence reduction, and for dismantling structural racism and inequity. I believe every member of this council is fully committed to those goals, even when we may not agree about every proposed solution to get us to those goals. This council and the mayor have already responded to the public outcry with immediate and bold actions for historic changes to LAPD, which built on the significant reforms that have already been made in recent years. We're moving forward, as several have mentioned already, with a groundbreaking proposal to develop a new model of unarmed crisis response in non-criminal situations. I can't stress enough how important that change is. Mr. Bonin spoke to it earlier. Mr. Blumenfield and others have spoken to this, how critically important that is to harm reduction, to reducing the risk of police violence, and also to more efficiently using our police resources. At Mr. Price's leadership and others, we're working to expand LAPD's mental evaluation unit and its system-wide mental assessment response teams so that they can intervene and de-escalate when officers are dealing with individuals in crisis. LAPD is already the most diverse large police department in the country, and fully 2/3 of its officers are people of color, including much of the command staff. Councilmember Price and other members of the council are pushing for new ways to further diversify LAPD's ranks, and especially to hire more African American officers, and that's a critically important next step as well. We're moving to implement peer intervention training, which will build on the mandatory harm reduction, de-escalation, and implicit bias training that all LAPD officers already now must receive. LA's diversion programs have reduced juvenile arrests by 85% compared to just 10 years ago. 85%. And we're working to expand them even further to keep as many young people as possible away from the criminal justice system. We're working to expand community safety partnerships throughout the city to build stronger relationships between officers and the people they serve. And some of the callers today were critical of community safety partnerships, but the people in those communities aren't critical of them. In fact, those programs have been so successful that there have been no serious uses of force by community safety partnership officers, and essentially no public complaints in 9 years. Our gang reduction youth development programs have doubled in recent years. Have expanded by 50% in recent years. Now, we still have a long way to go in all these areas and many more, and LAPD, of course, is far from perfect. The department still, even now, suffers from a legacy of its ugly history of race relations. But it's also true, and we have to be forthright about this. Since 1992, the LAPD has made remarkable progress in building community partnerships, hiring a far more diverse workforce, reducing deadly force, advancing constitutional policing, and rooting out corruption, bigotry, and implicit bias that were so much a part of its sad and ugly history before that. For more than a generation, the leadership of the African American community in Los Angeles has been the central force in driving those historically important reforms forward, working in partnership with the department. And as a result, fatal LAPD officer-involved shootings have been cut in half, and last year marked a 30-year low in LAPD shootings. And through that same time of reform, crime in Los Angeles has been dramatically reduced to the lowest rates in our lifetimes. The vast majority of dedicated and professional men and women of LAPD who made this progress possible, most of whom are themselves people of color, shouldn't be unfairly smeared or scapegoated because of the misconduct of other officers or other agencies. Our work is far from done. Too many people in this city, especially people of color, still feel that LAPD is disconnected from their neighborhood and serves as a deterrent rather than a contributor to building up communities. The voices of those who have that experience have to be heard and respected, and LAPD's leadership and its rank-and-file officers have to remain committed to continuing to improve. And this City Council will expect nothing less. More community engagement, more effective tangible steps to reduce violence and to increase trust and ensure accountability will be absolutely imperative, and we will demand nothing less. But let's be clear also. Some of the folks who called today indicated that cuts are not enough, reforms are not enough. We should abolish the police department, or we should decimate its funding. And let's all be eyes wide open about what we're talking about when we say things like that. That kind of massive reduction that we're supposed to make right now in LAPD's budget would mean laying off thousands of police officers immediately. And they'd be the youngest and most diverse part of the force. It would mean slashing community policing. It would mean a chaotic disruption of the department's progress in training and other reforms. And it would certainly mean that the people of Los Angeles would be less safe and more vulnerable. That's not what the people of this city want in this budget. So I think we need to take these very serious, significant cuts that are before us seriously. We need to make, we need to not leave LAPD out of this budget cut discussion that we're in. There's no way around that. But I think it's time that we really got realistic about the need that this city continues to have for police officers to ensure public safety, even as we're working to try to reduce the kinds of negative interactions that the community has with those same police officers. So with that, I'd like to invite other members to speak. Mr. Koretz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I associate myself with most of your remarks. Now I'd like to ask your indulgence for a couple of minutes because I've been accused a number of times of being a white supremacist because I don't support totally defunding the LAPD and eliminating law enforcement in Los Angeles. So I'd like just a couple minutes to lay out some of the highlights of my white supremacist resume. I authored the only bill in decades to halt the death penalty in California because unjustly a much higher percentage of black men are sentenced to death than white men, some of whom have later been found to be innocent. And Gavin Newsom implemented this 15 years later. I authored a bill to require automatic expungement of records when someone in jail is found innocent. Otherwise, when released, the innocent individuals who didn't have 10 grand or more for a lawyer to clear their name had a record that followed them around, resulting in the same high unemployment rate, homeless rate, and suicide rate as those who actually had committed crimes. A high percentage of those innocent with unexpunged criminal records were. I authored the legislation to change the purpose of California's criminal justice system in law from just punishment to punishment and rehabilitation to move us towards a more supportive system of reentry, especially for the high percentage of the incarcerated who are black. I led the effort to create and implement LA's targeted local hire program for city employees, which hires Angelenos who otherwise find it hard to get jobs, especially those who are homeless or formerly incarcerated, an unjust number of whom are black. Also, I authored the first attempt to allow same-sex civil marriage a few years before it became allowed in California. And while Donald Trump just removed protections from discrimination against transgender individuals in healthcare nationally, California still bans such discrimination because of a law I authored and got passed. But because I don't support the people's budget that eliminates the LAPD, with less funding for law enforcement than even our legal requirement to pay for retired officers' pensions, I'm a white supremacist. And because I expressed my sense of dismay about those who chose to use George Floyd's horrible murder as a cover to endanger the lives of my constituents and to destroy the mom-and-pop businesses in the Fairfax area, including many owned by black, brown, and immigrant owners, I'm a white supremacist. Well, most of those who support the complete defunding and the police don't remember when crime was much higher, when the murder rate was much, much higher than it is now. If you put an advisory vote on the ballot, supporters of the people's budget might be surprised to find that the elimination of law enforcement in Los Angeles would likely not pass in any part of the city. But what do people want to see changed? They don't want people in Los Angeles to be stopped for driving while black. They don't want to see black men and women shot at traffic stops and during other routine interactions. They don't want to see prosecutors allowed to exclude black jurors that get the convictions they want. They don't want to see police officers with a lot of complaints remain on the force. They don't want to see those officers who act with brutality against our black residents get off scot-free. They want to see body cameras for all officers, both for transparency for bad actors and protection for those who are not. They want to see us eliminate the worst of less than lethal practices and determine when the remaining ones should be used. They want to see us address the high rate of infant mortality among our black residents, the lower life expectancy, the high COVID rate, the food deserts where Popeyes and Burger King are available, but supermarkets with healthy food almost never are not. They want to see affirmative action in hiring and education. They want to see better mental health and homeless services. They want to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline. They want to see more affordable housing, better training of LAPD officers. They want to see a new model of response to nonviolent situations. And they want to see even greater expansion of juvenile diversion. So let's focus on getting the things done that we agree we must do, and that we all agree we must do, not on destroying public safety in LA. And now to the matter at hand, which is item 2. My staff and I have reviewed the CLA-CAO report carefully, and I take its proposals very seriously. But setting aside all of the proposed reductions it contains for a moment, I want to look at Recommendation 2. Recommendation 2 proposes a consultation with several departments and commissions about how best to reprogram any LAPD savings we might come up with in a manner consistent with the mayor's intention and the concerns of so many members of the public. I would offer the thought that we're currently on a path towards aggravating a lot of folks and pleasing no one with the proposed cuts. Perhaps it would be more preferable, more realistic, and more productive to take the essence of Recommendation 2 and expand it to encompass this entire exercise, both in terms of adjustments to the police budget and reprogramming of any savings. I think we should not only be consulting with city departments and commissions, but also with public safety experts, reform advocates, and other people with good ideas, and holding genuine public hearings, which hopefully will consist of more than epithets, in terms of how to do this. I expect the work of the CLA and CAO, and I respect their work, but they were given an impossible task, and they've now handed that impossible task to us. So I'd like us just to consider amending Recommendation 2 to include a more extensive and inclusive process regarding both reductions and reprogramming, with an eye towards bringing new recommendations back to the City Council during the fiscal year once they're actually ready for consideration. That's consistent with the spirit of how we're going to handle the overall city budget in anticipation of fluctuations in revenues and expenditures that we anticipate but can't yet pin down. And I would hold the rest of the item in committee until those new recommendations are ready for discussion. So that would be my suggestion. Otherwise, if we're going to discuss the CLA-CAO report and questions, I have them, but I will hand over the floor to the next council member and ask them in the next go-around.
All right, thank you, Mr. Koretz. Any other members wishing to be heard on the report? Mr. Bonin?
Thank you. First, question. I'm not sure what Mr. Koretz just suggested. Paul, Mr. Krekorian, or Mr. Koretz, is the intention of your motion to not make any cuts and hold this in committee until there are fully baked alternatives?
The idea basically, and it could result in more cuts or fewer cuts, is to do the whole thing in context, to look at the allocation for the needs that we find in the community, to look at the impacts of changing the way we do some things, including the idea of handling mental health with mental health professionals rather than the police, which in many cases have assumed these duties just because many of them are not our duties. They're the county's duties, but we have emergencies and they have a big budget, and so they've gotten a lot of tasks that are not their core mission, that they never asked to do. So if we make all those changes and we actually see what that really means, what is the percentage of the remaining LAPD budget? How much of those activities wind up going to better trained LAPD experts or experts that have nothing to do with the LAPD? There are a lot of unanswered questions, and I think rather than just slashing a random amount of money, and this is a very random amount of money, not in context with the needs of our city's budget, which is considerably more, I think it just doesn't make sense. So I'm suggesting an approach that mirrors what we're doing with the rest of the budget, which is we're not going to know how much we're short. We're going to be adjusting as we go. So as we plan for how we want to change the department, we then attach a dollar amount that matches, rather than just throwing out a number and trying to shoehorn it into the process.
Okay, all right. I'm not a second for that, just to be clear. So just I have a couple questions. My general take, and this ain't a speech, is I think based on the conversation we had with the chief earlier, based on the piece he wrote with a couple other chiefs, based on comments I have heard from as wide a range of opinions from BLM to LAPPL, everybody agrees that there's stuff the police are doing that they should not be doing. They disagree on the breadth and depth of that, but they all agree on that principle. And I think there's a couple different ways you go about that. You either start moving the funds from A in order to create B, or we wait until there's manna from heaven to fund a whole bunch of B, and then we don't need as much for A. I don't think that second thing is going to happen. I think we have to be moving and creating simultaneously. There's a tremendous need in Los Angeles. We will hear undoubtedly from the community on some more specifics and some priorities, but it's not as if there is a chance that the reinvestment is not needed. So I would suggest for item number 2, which is the figuring out how to spend the reallocated funds, I would suggest that we expand the definition of those who are engaged in that consultation to include community stakeholders and neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested in and disadvantaged. I would also suggest as part of that part of that conversation should be whether or not some of those funds should be used to forestall the furloughs that are going to have service impacts that are particularly harsh upon the communities we are trying to protect. Whether or not disinvesting, as we are in this budget, in HSID is going to make it harder for people to get protection as renters, or whether minority-owned small businesses are going to have a hard time getting access to a microloan. We need to be thinking about those kind of things and figuring out, in consultation with community, what the most judicious investments are. So I don't see a choice but to be making cuts. I've got a couple questions about one element of it in particular. On item number K in the CAO-CLA recommendations, reducing civilian hiring from 145 to 0 positions. How many officers does that take off of patrol and put on desk duty? Anybody from LAPD able to answer that? Is LAPD there?
Yeah, this is Mike Moore. So to eliminate all of the civilian hiring, you're going to jeopardize the PSRs. I can't put police officers in communication centers. They can't work the 911 operating boards. The level of training, it's a 13 to 19 month ordeal for someone to learn how to do 911 dispatch. In regards to detention officers, that's going to be in the scale of 25 to 50 police officers by not hiring the 25 to 50 detention officers. So, and then as to the remaining civilians, as I said, I look to cut back services rather than to assign one for one, but there would be a portion of critical services. So to eliminate all of the hiring in K, it's more than just 140. Reduce hiring from 145 to 0. I think the total number of positions would be 275. Yeah.
So, what do you mean the total will be 275? From
hiring, we're going to try 275 people, civilians. So we're going to drop from 3,000 to under 27 to 2750 or less, 2725. And then on top of that, you have a civilian workforce that has a 10% furlough. And again, those 275 positions, the 140 of those are non-PSR, non-custody services positions. And so the 140 would take some ability to backfill. I can't backfill PSRs, and I would try to backfill some portion of the jailers. But what I would rather do is shut down my remaining satellite posts, so I have a regional jail facility rather than these remaining satellite posts that I identified earlier.
So what I'm trying to get to, and this is not a place, I don't think this is a place you want me to go, but isn't it, don't we do more to preserve patrols by making a smaller cut to civilian and a deeper to sworn?
No.
Well, if a lot of those civilian positions are going to be taken up by cops, officers, sworn officers, isn't it cheaper to keep the civilians on and make the cuts elsewhere?
Now, the challenge with cutting back in sworn hiring, because we've already cut in this budget proposal over 100 positions. And so to cut that further is going to lengthen response times. It's going to lengthen workload on the existing staff. And you also have 140 fewer civilian positions already cooked in there as well. And so it's a double whammy. It's not a matter of, you're no longer in a this or that. The budget proposal before us is to reduce 140 civilian positions. That's going to hurt. And to reduce 100 fewer police officers. That's going to hurt. To whether the budget that was brought before you with by the CLA and CAO has within it a couple of different additional levers, which is to further amplify civilian shortages by not hiring any PSRs or detention officers. The PSRs I can't replace, so there we see the deterioration of our call load, our ability to handle 911 calls, to answer those in a manner which we're presently not in state compliance. It's only going to worsen that. And then on the jail side, the running of those outlying jails I would shutter those in order to ensure that the 3 regional jails, which have medical facilities and are the most efficient of all the jails, are maintained. The 140 civilians is what, if you didn't have any civilian cutbacks, if we didn't have furloughs and we didn't have a cutback of these other civilian positions, so we just maintained staffing of civilian of 3,000. That's not been a proposal before us, but that is a proposal I support. And as to then the sworn counterpart, you have 100 reduction in sworn members, I would think a lesser impact would be, because you do have a cash flow issue and you do have an economic recession or depression, is to defer some costs of that workforce going forward. I recognize and heard clearly by Councilman Krekorian is that this city and the hole in the boat in this city is significant, and that the ability to fund this city needs to be protected with its existing obligations. And yet I also heard clearly, and as you referenced my byline for an op-ed piece yesterday with Chief Scott and Chief Ortiz, I'm also looking forward to an opportunity to redirect. But we can't do the redirect until we have something to redirect it to. These are 911 calls that we cannot simply say, sorry, wrong police department, but we'll have somebody send them to you. We have to have a workforce that can handle that. And the last time we had 9,700 officers, Councilman, we've had an increase of 63% in call load. And so if we lose personnel, the bone that was cut by Mr. Llewellyn referenced, that bone that is cut is going to saw out other deployments of resources that I can no longer, even though they need to be in those communities and backstopped in those communities, I don't see how those can continue given the call load. Currently, we spend about 55 minutes on average to respond to a routine call for service, about 20 minutes for an urgent call, and about 6 minutes for an emergency call. The routine and urgent calls are the ones that give me the greatest concern, because those are all calls for police service. And reducing a field force by hundreds of officers and thinking that we're going to provide for that is I don't see how. I mean, I welcome people to come in and show us how that would happen, but it doesn't pencil out.
So I agree that you need somewhere else for those calls to go. Where we disagree, I think, is on how that happens. Because as long as there is no money earmarked for the alternative is never going to happen.
Let me just say,
sure, there are things in the UB that we have wind up approving the details of later, because we know if we don't put them in the UB, there ain't going to be any money there, and the program's never going to happen. Whether it's Airbnb enforcement a couple of years ago, or any number of things, it's just you got to do that. I mean, the way I look at it is,
we have to do it, sir. If I might interrupt, we have to do it in a manner that's thoughtful for public safety. And I look to every model. We're looking presently in Sacramento, Albuquerque, Eugene, Oregon, other locations, and we would look to establish a pilot, an effort perhaps in South Los Angeles that would try to demonstrate a circuit. I would look to hire in the city, or use community-based organizations to identify a workforce. We've had a similar challenge in our homelessness, and I would look to that success in that arena is our ability to hire outreach and engagement that works something other than 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. It's been a challenge in that arena, and I believe it'll be a challenge here. But I welcome that opportunity, and I look forward, and I believe you don't have to take money out of the existing programming within Los Angeles Police Department that have to service those existing thousands of calls in an ambition to establish a destination and then establish the capacity. Let's establish the capacity and then do the realignment.
Well, at some point, you got to balance the scales. We can't just we can't find $1 billion for the other stuff and expect that all of a sudden we have a budget with an additional $1 billion. I mean, it's going to have to come from somewhere. I just want to make sure we talk about.
I'm sure you would respect.
Steve, if I could let Mr. Butler finish, please.
I'm sorry.
I just want to point out, when we talk about public safety, I just want to make sure that, because I've been talking to my constituents, I've surveyed my constituents, public safety has got to mean, every time we talk about it, not just LAPD. It's also LAFD, it's also city attorney, it's also homeless services, it's Department of Mental Health, it's traffic officers, it's the mediators and the nonviolent stuff we're talking about. So we're all talking about public health. We're just talking about the way to get there. So my basic take on this is that for any number of confluence of reasons, a different emerging different perspective on public safety and a fiscal crisis. Those two things both come together and say, okay, we need to be making cuts in LAPD. There's just no way around it fiscally, as Mr. Krekorian outlined. There are some of these type of cuts that the CLA and CAO has outlined. In a department that's 94% personnel, there's not a lot of ways around it, right? It's after you do this, you go any deeper, and the only other places you can cut is more overtime, is deferring raises, or is laying folks off. There's no other place to go. So we get your resistance and frustration with some of the stuff before us. You're a general manager. You should be fighting for your department. We get that. But if not these cuts, what?
So in looking at the proposals that were presented by the CLA and CAO, I'm drawn to the fact of no good choices. However, in recognizing the city cannot continue to fund itself as it is, give me a moment, please. You have a number of proposals before you, and I would draw your attention to number A, B, a portion of C, E, and L, totaling over $100 million. And those are matters of, a portion of it is to reduce reduce the size of the department, the sworn size of the department by over 100 sworn personnel. It includes, of course, the standing mayor's proposal, which is a reduction of 140 civilians that will lose gains that we've built. It's taken 3 years to build to, but that's a hit. It's the furloughs of 10% remain. It is also a reduction in the added staffing of 12 positions, less one for technology, and that being the deputy chief for technology. We cannot, and to Mr. Blumenfield's remarks, there's never been a more critical time that we stay invested in technology. People are our most expensive commodity, but the rate of return on technology is tenfold easily. Lastly, and these are difficult, and that's E and L. And E and L is a sacrifice of the ability to pay as you go on emergency and non-reimbursable overtime, which is all of the same issue, which is an officer is required to work into the evening hours because of a rape investigation or because of an arrest, or we have a body that's found, and we have detectives coming in off hours in which to report that. I suffer and support MOUs that provide for compensation for both those instances, and it requires the use of overtime in order to meet those needs. This will provide you on a cash flow issue of $101 million plus that can help, in addition to the cuts that we've already sustained in the mayor's belt-tightening and budget proposal that was given to this council in April. So it's more than $100 million in size and scope.
Just want to make sure I heard you correctly. A, which is the 6.8 from Metro for the Crenshaw line. Is actually, okay, they have the down here in the attachment, the 6.8 from the Metro Crenshaw not opening. B is the savings from sworn deployment of 16 million. Then you said E, which is the non-reimbursable sworn overtime for.
I said C. You go to C.
Okay.
Well, and I need would need to work with the council on the issue of the deputy chief's position, so I can maintain our work on our technology modernization. Now, whether that was an in lieu authority or something in regards to reach the cost savings needed for that position, but that DC position, the philanthropic raise by the foundation, which has already invested monies to the tune of $10 million and a $170 million investment scheme, I believe is needed to see that through. But that would give you still just under $2 million of savings on those other positions. Additionally, is under E, which is it's listed E and L, are two segments of non-reimbursable overtime, as I understand it. And those savings between those areas exceed $100 million in savings, which achieves...
So make sure I get the letters correctly. A, B as in boy, C as in celery, E as in echo, L as in LAPD.
That was in Lincoln, yes, but also as in LAPD.
All right, thanks. I'm going to look over those as the discussion continues. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bonin. Mr. Blumenfield, any questions or comments?
Not really. I guess I'll just make a quick comment, which is, in some ways, we're positioned to make this transition because we have to make the cuts now just because of the budget reality. We're going to have to make real cuts everywhere in this budget. But unlike, cuts that we made years ago during the last recession in the city and when I was at the state, we knew it would take a long time to come back. The hope is that these cuts will come back much sooner. We'll get a vaccine next year or something to that effect, and the fundamentals of the economy are still there, so that we will, hopefully, within a year or so, be back in a growth period. And so I think that gives us the time now. We make these cuts, we start developing the programs, we start investing in those programs, but as the city is going to inevitably grow in the future, we get to be in a very good position to make real investments, heavier investments, as we grow. So that's sort of the trajectory I see us going in. But I just think, again, it's not about punitive measures. It's a fiscal reality, and that is coinciding with the desire to see this reform and the alternative interventions. And in some ways, they can play well together by making the cuts we need to now and by developing the programs and growing into the future. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll get to you in a second, Mr. Koretz, but Mr. Bonin made a few points that I think are important to keep in mind about current cuts that other departments are facing and the impacts that those cuts themselves will have on the very communities that we're trying to lift up right now. And I look at HSID, I look at EWDD, I look at Rec and Parks, which Rec and Parks has been, one of my personal priorities for restoration for years, and we still aren't where we need to be with Rec and Parks since the last Great Recession. And now here we are, facing more really harmful cuts to Rec and Parks. And the employees of these departments are imminently facing furloughs starting 2 weeks from now. And so I think as we talk about these reductions, and I get what you're saying, Mr. Koretz, about wanting to take a more thoughtful approach, and I'm all for taking thoughtful approaches, as you know, I strive to be. But right now, we're facing imminent cuts in the very areas that we're talking about investing more in. And I think our first goal needs to be to prevent that from happening. So one of the suggestions that I would like to put out for discussion, and I'll eventually be constructing a motion to that effect, is we should set aside savings, that whatever savings we agree that we're going to achieve with LAPD, we should set those aside for a few things, a few priorities. Number one, preventing furloughs from happening for the first quarter of the fiscal year. Ensuring that we at least maintain our emergency reserve policy of 2.75%, because we're not even at our emergency reserve right now. So if there's, God forbid, an earthquake or something else right now, we don't even have the emergency reserve to fall back on. So we at least need to come up to the emergency reserve. And then I think for whatever other savings we can realize, keeping it in the UB for mid-year adjustments as we develop these alternative programs that we've talked about, that we're moving forward, as we see what the needs are of the existing services that are being provided in disadvantaged communities, as the revenue situation inevitably gets worse. Then we can make a more thoughtful assessment about where the need is and apply it accordingly. But I'd be loath right now to find cuts in LAPD that we then reprogram into something that we have to cut 2 months from now or 3 months from now because the revenues have fallen short. I just think it makes more sense to take it methodically. First, eliminating furloughs. Second, getting back up to the emergency reserve level. And third, setting it aside for mid-year adjustments so that as the revenue situation becomes clearer, we can know how much to allocate where and what the best and most effective way to do that would be. So that's going to be my suggestion as we move forward. But I wanted to hear from other members as well. Mr. Koretz, Mr. Price, did you have anything? Yeah.
I did. Mr. Chairman, first of all, thank you for your comments, Mr. Chairman, and for those of my colleagues. All I thought thoughtful and on the point. But we are in the need of immediate action now. I'm not trying to be dramatic, immediate action now, but this is an opportunity for us to take a bold step towards a policy shift that we know is necessary. We know it's necessary. I certainly agree with my colleagues. We are excited about the opportunity to shift non-armed responses to domestic situations. I was in on that motion, figuring out how we can provide a better, more sensitive response. I agree certainly that we need to have a broad-based community input into this process. There needs to be broad input from all stakeholders, and certainly support that process. But we got to act now, gang. We have to act now. This past weekend, in my district, 18-year-old was shot. I attended trade tag. He was shot by a sheriff deputy. But as far as the community is concerned, he was shot by the police. Law enforcement again. And that tragic death again just underscores the conversation that's happening all over this country, all over the country and around the world, on the accountability of our officers, the responsiveness of our system, the equity, the equality in our societies. And so, members, again, I think this is an important opportunity for us. I certainly would like to move that we approve recommendations A through L from the CAO's report, and that we move this matter forward to the City Council for its approval. $150 million transferred for the benefit to reinvest in the disadvantaged and communities of color in our city. The motion, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Mr. Koretz.
Well, first of all, I can't disagree with some of the things that Mr. Krekorian said. We certainly have needs within the city to do some of the things that we're looking to do with this funding. So I agree it should be used to help defend against furloughs. And then we have other things that are frustrating. We've been trying to get an eviction defense program going since I first introduced a motion to do this, I don't remember now, 2-3 years ago. We still haven't really funded it. We have a great targeted local hiring program. Now we have a hiring freeze, so we're going to decimate hiring in the very communities that we want to hire. So there are a number of things even within the city budget that this money could go for. If I had to prioritize my greatest concern concerned, it is where cutting money is going to cost us money. So reduction C is a relatively modest amount of money for accountants who are involved in helping the department get important grants that fund services and undertakings. And the mayor also has a team that works on these grants. And I would ask, what is the collaboration between the department and the mayor? And what would the impact of not filling these positions be on LAPD and their funding? So I don't know if the chief or CAO or CLA want to answer that question.
So I can speak to this as each of the positions. For instance, there are 3 positions there that deal with the Office of the Inspector General, a bolstering or building up of his staffing. Then you also have a couple of senior accountants. You have a safety engineer that goes to the matters of injuries, worker comp injuries that occur in the workplace, and it's an engineer's position that's meant to do worksite analysis in an effort to reduce liability in workplace injuries. And then the coordination with the mayor's office on grant matters, I think, is good. It is the grant environment is a challenging environment for us at the state and federal level today, given there's just a set of circumstances out there that this city and this agency has faced struggle in the last 3 years as far as a grant environment. But we work very aggressively with the mayor's staff in finding opportunities.
And as has been noted already, one of the positions not filled by Reduction C is a deputy chief for technology, and everything that we do in the LAPD relating to technology is creating efficiencies and better targeting resources, and that position as well, I think, is absolutely critical. We have a situation, which I think comes under another reduction, where some of our computers were taking an hour a day of officers' time to boot up. And so the cost of not implementing those technological changes results in massive amounts of person hours of LAPD time. So it is an opportunity to cut where you're not cutting people, but as a practical matter, it causes a fair amount of harm in that we're not able to have the efficiencies, and we're actually costing ourselves money. So I think that's true in reductions G and H also. Cuts to records management technology and new workstations, which would impact the overall upgrade we authorized more than a year ago to reduce the time officers and staff wait for old systems to function. So at a minimum, I would ask that reduction C and reduction H not be done just because they cost us so much more in efficiencies. And while there's some that would find that good because the goal is to make the LAPD as ineffective as possible and eventually to eliminate them, but I think those changes are the most critical to deal with and the most cost-effective and relatively small dollar. As far as overtime, what happens if we have an emergency, like another massive wildfire or an earthquake of the kind that we have every few decades? What would that do in terms of overtime, and would we have any ability to react to those emergencies? And again, I would ask the chief that question.
So the compensatory time versus cash time has been an experience that the department has in 2010, 11, 12, 13, and similar in those situations when fires or emergencies struck, officers will come. They'll respond. It does bank the time. I will remind that those type of disasters are frequently FEMA and emergency reimbursed by local disaster declarations. And so it affords our ability to take that off the book by recouping the recoveries. And as a matter of course, there's some current, the $35 million was encumbered this most recent mobilization. That's money that's going to come back, and I think there was a motion for the CLA-CAO to see how to recover that as a means of helping the checkbook here. So it's not desirous to do this, but I clearly hear that we can't continue the way we have it. If I curtail on hiring, even on one item, which was the issue of cutting down to half of our hiring, it'll slow us and it impacts our ability for diversity, for African American and for women and Asian Pacific Islanders, and a simple move of reducing from 500 to 251 will take us 2 to 3 years to recover if we were to recover. But to Councilman Bonin's position, I understand that we may not recover to that because if there's some future state that we have a baton to hand off to another department, there is that type of alignment. But I worry about the stand-up of that type of capacity in the next 12 months. I'm a realist in that regard, and so cutting down these resources is going to impact our service times and deliveries while we try to build a capacity to transfer responsibilities of a portion of our workload.
And presumably, as discussed in passing a little bit earlier, if you have a situation where we have to call officers in a massive emergency, and it's not budgeted, it's not reimbursable, there's no other way to pay for it, we just wind up banking the overtime. And that presumably saves us in this budget year, but as was mentioned, you accumulate it now and you pay it out at your future salary. So someone could be a brand new officer and banking hours of overtime and then get reimbursed for that when they're an assistant chief or a sergeant or whatever the position is that they retire with. That's a considerably higher salary. So that makes this an inefficient choice that gets us through the budget year and costs us much more significantly years down the line. And am I safe in assuming that that is correct?
Well, it does. You are paying you're paying the MOU. So it's about a 3.5-4% rate of return on that 1 year deferral. Unless, of course, what was mentioned earlier is that the city does see funding that comes in and can address that shortfall. And I would hope that in the next 3 to 6 months, there's the HEROES Act and other acts that are in play in Congress that would allow the city to restore funding in regards to its overtime so that it pays as it goes. So if you were to restore, for instance, furloughs for the next quarter, but yet move overtime to compensatory time as a means of trying to see what will come to allow us to be whole, then that's a strategy. But that's a budget strategy for this. That as a general manager, obviously, my responsibilities is just how to address workload, and the workload is hours and personnel, and that's what I'm trying to my advocacy for. How the strategies of how to balance those with compensatory time versus staff time, furloughs versus no furloughs, those are matters of obviously before the.
Okay, and a question for the CAO. What are the effects these reductions might have on the Personnel Department's Public Safety Division? Because I understand that the division's responsible for recruiting and hiring 85 different classifications across 9 departments. Everything from animal control officer to airport police to park rangers, traffic officers. So how will that cut impact the department's overall ability to function?
Councilmember, we did look at that, and there was relatively limited personnel staff that is 100% public safety focused. And in this proposal, at least, they will be continuing to hire police and fire, so there are very limited reductions to personnel.
Very good.
If any.
Well, as my colleagues know, I'm not enthusiastic about doing this at this time in this order and have suggested an alternative methodology. But were we not able to do that and just looking at massive cuts, I would implore you to take the few $1 million that the categories I have mentioned and not include them. So we can implement the technologies which I encouraged us to do 10 years ago in the last recession to get us out of the situation we're in by creating efficiencies and reducing our costs dramatically. So not that I will support this anyway, but I would encourage us to look at the few $1 million that we would save and the dramatic amount of efficiency savings that we would get out of that.
And Mr. Koretz, again, to make clear, you specified recommendations C, D, H, and what else?
Let me look at my notes. Was it D and H?
D and H, sir.
Yes.
G as in George?
Yes. G as in George, H as in Harry.
C, D, G, and H. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Koretz. Other members? Mr. Blumenfield, anything else?
I mean, I spoke about G and H, and I agree on the computer stuff that it's a tiny amount, and it's penny wise and pound foolish for the record systems.
Yeah, I share those same concerns about C, D, G, and H, and that also K, in that we've made progress in civilian hiring that has needed to be done for all these years, and I'm hesitant. I really don't want to backslide on that progress that we've made. So those were my areas of concern as well.
Which ones, Mr. Krekorian, were yours?
C, D, and K were my priorities for preservation, and then Mr. Koretz had added G and H. And I know that Mr. Blumenfield and Mr. Koretz have both expressed concerns about overtime. I share those concerns as well, but I just don't know where else we can go to get the kind of short-term, immediate savings that we need to preserve the rest of the services that are going to be imperative in the coming months. So I think what I would suggest is that we recommend the reductions proposed by the CLA in A, B, E, F, I, J, and L. So that would leave off C, D, G, H, and K. And then the savings that are realized from those recommendations would be placed in, would be used to cancel 3 months of civilian furloughs across all departments, placed in the UB for furlough reduction. That an appropriate amount would be transferred to the emergency reserve to bring it up to the minimum policy level of 2.75, and that the remaining balance of any savings should be placed in the UB reserve for mid-year adjustments for further consideration by this committee and the council.
Mr. Krekorian? Yeah, can I add that the overtime thing we've talked about, I know we need to do it, but as I mentioned earlier, financially, it's just, it's putting it on a high interest credit card. So I would also ask that we look into expeditiously using FEMA and other federal funds to pay down that credit card at the appropriate time in terms of the comp pay, just so that doesn't get out of hand. We need to do it right away. I get that, but to plant that seed out there, so when we for actual overtime expenses, to use that money down the road to pay down an exorbitant comp time.
Yeah, it's a major issue, because you're right, and as others have mentioned, we're saving money in the first fiscal year, in the immediate fiscal year, by reducing overtime, but we end up paying a whole lot more down the road, and this is one of those accrued obligations that it's certainly not the preferred course, but it may be the only course available to us in the emergency that we're in. So I would again ask that, in light of Mr. Blumenfield's comments, which are well taken, that we have the CLA ensure that we have, or make recommendations to us to ensure that all reimbursements for all available reimbursable expenses are sought through FEMA on a timely basis and regularly reported back to this committee, so that we can monitor the receipt of those funds. So the other thing with FEMA reimbursement is there's no guarantee that we'll realize even a penny of that in this fiscal year, or next fiscal year for that matter. They take time to get back, but we do absolutely need to be submitting every penny of reimbursable expense for that expense for FEMA reimbursement.
I'm just saying there's this nexus with the actual overtime costs that are getting those reimbursements, and using whatever we can get reimbursed for those costs on the back end, so we can actually pay the comp time. I'm not, obviously there's going to be a million different FEMA reimbursements that go a million different ways, but when we look at the actual reimbursements for overtime policing, that can help pay the actual comp time down the road, and just to keep that nexus there. So it's not just this freewheeling thing about looking at all of the funds, but saying we're going to track the overtime policing and use that to prevent this huge growing debt on overtime policing. The two are connected.
Yep. Is that clear to the CLA?
Yes, and Mr. Chair, just one comment relative to the FEMA reimbursements. Actually already being tracked by the CAO's office. I see actually Patty Huber on the line, but that is actually going to your ad hoc COVID-19 recovery committee as well. And so we're monitoring the expenditures, making sure that we're tracking everything and submitting for the maximum amount of reimbursement. And it's just a balance of, whether we try and wait for the FEMA dollars, which may take time, it may come over several fiscal years, and so they may not be available. We're balancing that with need to use CARES Act money as well. And just one other thing before I let Patty speak. On those items which you suggested that they be deleted from the list, those total about $17 million for your information.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bonin.
Yeah, some questions. I think Mr. Price has a direction. I think you guys have a direction. I think they differ both on the cuts and on the places that are reallocated. So the total deletions from the recommended cuts, total, you said 17, Sharon?
Yes.
And that, again, was... And what else?
It totals $17 million. And
so which recommendations again?
So there were recommendations. Number C is in Charlie, D is in David, G is in golf, H is in Harry, A is in Karen.
Okay. All right. And then, so there is no commensurate increase in cuts elsewhere. We're not. Can you spare those cuts and is there room to do an additional $17 million in sworn overtime?
So the only other areas that we looked at, and I see Rich is on the line too, we did look at eliminating all of police hiring. That would generate an additional $25 million. But we do realize that when you stop hiring of police, it takes a long time to restart that process. And so that's why we were recommending that it just be slowed down in half.
Well, many things take a long time. That's why I've been saying for 2 months that we need to reopen the contract. And is it possible to, I mean, if the council has a goal of getting to, in this round of 150, is there any additional and sworn overtime that is able to help make up the difference?
I mean, given the comments that some of your colleagues have made, I mean, yes, there is some more capacity in sworn overtime, but the more and more you put into sworn overtime and the more you take from it, it just means that the likelihood of more hours and costs being banked becomes more likely.
Got it. Okay. And then, so that's the Krekorian motion. And Mr. Price's motion is to approve A through L, yes?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Mr. Price?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes,
and,
correct.
And I understand Mr. Krekorian's outline of where the money would go. Mr. Price, yours is simply as stated in the motion. Is that correct?
Say?
Where the money would go, it's as written in the motion?
Correct. Into the, UBE.
Into that account in the UB. A clarification for you, Mr. Price, and asking if this would be a friendly amendment. If that fund can include as potential expenditures to be determined by the process, include as potential expenditures opportunities to prevent furloughs that would cause service cuts that would impact disadvantaged communities.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, I can live with that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now I understand what the options are. Thank you. Oh, so for the record, with that, I'll second Mr. Price's motion, since he made a motion that I didn't hear.
Let's go.
Mr. Blumenfield? Okay. Okay, well, thank you for trying to clarify that, Mr. Bonin, but I'm not exactly clear on what the friendly amendment was now, and I assume you were offering a friendly amendment, but I'm not clear on what that was.
My amendment was to the way I understand it is there's two different proposals. Mr. Price wants to do all cuts. Some of you want to do fewer cuts. That sort of alphabet soup of ones not to cut, totaling 16 or 17 million. He wants to put all the money into the account for underserved or disadvantaged communities. You want to put it into the UB for a broader range, including the emergency reserve and forestalling first quarter furloughs. What I did was I asked on his direction of where the funds go if the definition of the universe of possible funding is to forestall furloughs that would have service impacts on disadvantaged communities. Does that make sense?
It does. It's different, clearly, than what I had stated, and I appreciate you trying to find some middle ground there, but I think it's just imperative that we at least get to the emergency policy level before we can think about adding any additional costs to any department, even existing departments, let alone new expenditures. So,
mine was not a friendly amendment to your motion. Mine was Price's motion.
I got it, and I'm restating why my motion, which I guess I will make formally as a motion now, is different than what you've just stated. They both achieve largely the same objective of the majority of these cost reductions, and they're appropriated in slightly different categories and preserved for future discussion, because under both circumstances they're part of the UB, the unappropriated balance, which would mean that this committee and the council would have to come back and have further discussion about those savings in any event. But I do think it's important that this committee make the policy statement that furlough reduction and getting the emergency reserve dealt with, it has to come before even a penny of additional money is spent. So I'm going to go ahead and make the motion then of what I had previously said, which is to approve the recommendations for reductions in A, B, E, F, I, J, and L, and to place an amount sufficient to meet the emergency reserve policy of 2.75% of general fund revenues into the emergency reserve with those savings, to put an amount sufficient to cancel 3 months of civilian furloughs across all departments in the UB for furlough reduction, to recommend that the remaining balance should be placed in the UB reserve for mid-year adjustments, and ask that we approve these recommendations as an instruction for the CLA to incorporate into their report, along with recommendations 1, 2, 3, and 5 in the CAO-CLA report for the committee's consideration on June 29th.
Second.
Okay. So if we can call for a roll call vote, then please, on that motion.
Krekorian.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
We're voting on
I'm sorry. Mr. Price, go ahead.
I'm asking whose motion are we voting on first, yours or mine?
Oh, that I was calling for a vote on mine.
All right, I thought ours came up first, but you're the chair. I'll defer to you.
Actually, you know,
Is yours a substitute motion?
What's that?
Is yours a substitute motion?
Yeah.
I might suggest, because I think I can count, that if you do the vote on Mr. Price's motion, and it does not go Mr. Price's way, then you have vote for the second motion to be.
And I think that's actually the right way to go anyway, now that you pointed out. Anyway, okay, so I rescind my previous request for the roll call. Let's go ahead and ask for a roll call on Mr. Price's motion.
Thank you. This would be the motion introduced by Mr. Price, seconded by Councilmember Bonin with the friendly amendment. Krekorian.
No.
Price.
Aye.
Koretz.
No.
Blumenfield.
No.
Bonin.
Aye.
This item does not pass.
All right. I'd like to ask now for a roll call on the motion that I stated, which mercifully I'm not going to reread, but I think I've said it enough times that we all have taken careful notes. So let's go ahead and call the roll on that.
Thank you. Krekorian.
Aye.
Price.
No.
Koretz.
Aye.
Blumenfield.
Aye.
Bonin.
Aye.
This item is approved.
All right. Very good. Thank you very much, members. Next up is item 20.
Item 20 is continued from June 15th, 2020. It's a CAO report and motion, Rodriguez-Martinez, relative to amending the mayor's proposed budget for fiscal year 2020-21 to provide $100,000 funding to expand the LAPD's Through Our Eyes program partnership to all community safety partnership sites and identify additional youth-serving organizations to build similar engagement and relationship-based programs.
Members, any comments, questions, discussions about this item?